In late October, when most boating people are putting their craft in winter storage, the Cahall family of Madison, Indiana is still on the water, much to my good fortune. Delta Cahall, her son, Terry Cahall, along with their friend Tony Thompson, had come up the Kentucky to Frankfort to meet me as arranged. With the fall foliage at its peak, I was to spend a leisurely 3 days cruising the lower reaches of the Kentucky. This 65-mile stretch of the river, starting just below Frankfort and ending at the Ohio River near Carrollton, would be the final leg of my year-long journey. By late afternoon of our first day, we arrived at our first stop, the mouth of Elkhorn Creek, 13 miles below Frankfort in Franklin County. Going up the creek was a bit tight for a 32-foot houseboat, but Terry handled it with admirable skill.
There y'all having a good trip?
Our boat can only go a few hundred yards up the creek to a small dock and canoe livery service operated by Dave Strohmeyer, our host for the evening. Just upstream from the dock, beyond the river's backwater, you can see why Elkhorn Creek is famous as one of the most beautiful streams to flow into the Kentucky. At one time, before the Ice Age, the Elkhorn was an ancient river. But after the glaciers of that period changed the face of this part of the continent, it receded into its present bed of nearly 100 miles of alternating shoals and naturally created pools, a canoeist's paradise. It sure is interesting to come in on this big houseboat from up the narrow creek here after being on the big river.
I imagine would be maybe a little more interesting than a rowboat. Having to come all the way down.
The mouth of Elkhorn is another of those confluences, like the mouth of Red River and Dix River, that have a kind of power. Early in this century, people dug up Indian artifacts by the buckets full from the bottomland near the creek, some of it indicating that people have made use of this place for perhaps 4,000 years. After the Indians, settlers claimed the area as prime farming land. From the early 1920s up to the 1950s, a series of hotels were located here. The last of these buildings remain to remind us of an era when this part of the Kentucky River Valley was widely known as a resort and vacation land. That all came to an end with the advent of modern roads and the automobile vacation. You know something I learned by looking at a map that was in the National Geographic? That when you talk about the Ohio River Valley, see, in my mind, that has always meant Pittsburgh coming down past Cincinnati and Paducah and on to the...
but it's also all the tributaries?
That's right. And you see how far south that goes and drains all of Tennessee, Georgia. I mean, there are deep south states. The water flows north. The Tennessee River system empties into the Ohio River Valley.
Yeah.
And I'd say to set out to discover and understand the Ohio River Valley would be a wonderful project, you know, to try to navigate those streams and just understand the river system.
It would almost take a lifetime.
It would indeed. A lifetime indeed, but nothing compared with the long continuity of human use of this place. We were merely the latest human beings to abide here for a day or night. Others have been camping here, making use of this place, and no doubt having the rain fall on them since the days before the first Egyptian pyramid was built. Thomas Wolfe wrote a novel called Of Time and the River. Certainly a river does embody time. Rain came down on us as we slept, and on the river as we set out again the next morning, exactly as it had been coming down since time and the river both began. Everything in nature happening around us had happened millions of times before. Every kingfisher and great blue heron we saw had ancestors reaching back beyond our capacity to imagine. Every tree on the riverbank had its predecessor, generation on generation, millions and millions of years. I woke up keenly aware that the day before us was to be our last day on the river this trip, and that by evening we would be at the mouth of the Kentucky and the ending place of all my river travels for the year. But our journey had not yet ended. One of the most beautiful places in the Kentucky River Valley, and one of the most interesting, awaited us as we made our last stop of the voyage at the mouth of Drennon Creek in Henry County. From the old landing there, I climbed steps where people had been climbing steps since the mid-1800s, when the mineral springs on Drennon Creek were first developed as a health resort, attended by people from all over the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, from as far south as New Orleans. Horse-drawn carriages awaited the visitors at the top of the hill in the 1840s, and a carriage awaited me too. This one driven by Mr. Jack Sharp, a Drennon resident, who had agreed to drive me along the same road the vacationers had taken to the springs so long ago.
That's great. Boy, this is the best ride I've had in a long time.
Drennon's first significance to living creatures was ages ago, when the mammoths and mastodons and ancient bison and other prehistoric creatures were drawn to the salt licks and grazing meadows that have always characterized the location. Indians came to Drennon in pursuit of the beasts and used the mineral licks as a source of salt and for healing purposes long after the giant animals were gone. In the comparatively recent history of the steamboat era, Drennon attracted speculators and investors interested in the development potential of the ancient grazing grounds. The pioneers had learned from the Indians of the reputed health-giving powers of the waters from Drennon Springs. So it was perhaps inevitable that a health spa would be established there. By 1846, A hotel large enough to accommodate 300 to 400 guests had been erected on the grounds. Daily boat and stagecoach service brought people from the deep south to spend their vacations at Drennon Springs. They came for the waters, but they also came because it was a fashionable place where one might meet a future husband or wife. Many people came to Drennon thinking it was a refuge from recurring cholera epidemics. But when cholera broke out at Drennon in 1849, the whole place was deserted within 24 hours, and Drennon never again flourished as a health resort. The Drennon area is representative of the meadows and farmlands found throughout the lower reaches of the Kentucky River Valley. Here, only a few miles upstream from the Ohio River, the valley is at its broadest, and the farms slope right to the water's edge. As we cruised on those last few miles above the Ohio, I was thinking about how the water we were floating on now had come from so many smaller streams, and how truly vast is the area drained by the Kentucky River system. The total valley is as big as whole countries in other parts of the world. In a way, a river valley is a country, created by the waters shaping the land and by the stories of the people who inhabit that land. In this sense, the Kentucky River is merely a part of that larger country called the Ohio River Valley, and the Mississippi River Valley too. We don't lose anything when we remember what we are only a part of. Indeed, we gain. Because in knowing our part in the grand integrity of the world, we find our place on earth and the beginnings of coherence for our lives. The first people to live in this valley several thousand years ago had no difficulty at all in feeling the rivers as sacred forces of nature. Modern people seem to have lost the capacity to see rivers or any aspect of nature in that delicate light. I don't think people have lost the capacity, which is a human capacity, so much as they have merely forgotten it. The great thing about spending time on the river is the way the river itself begins to speak to you, trying to remind you of what it is you have forgotten and how you might call it back to life again.